In the IELTS speaking test, how would you answer the question, where did you grow up? It's such a simple question that it can be easy to run out of things to say. So in this episode, we'll cover a number of options for expanding your answer. Hi, my name's Vic, and this is episode 22 of the IELTS with Vic podcast. Remember, if you want a free copy of the podcast transcript, just head over to my IELTS blog to request it. So, let's get started with today's topic then. Where did you grow up? I could answer this question really quickly by saying, I grew up in England. However, that isn't going to get me the band score that I want. I need to say more. One easy way to expand the above answer is to be more specific about the name of the town or city and the area within the country. So, if you're from Vietnam, for example, instead of saying, I grew up in Vietnam, you could say something like, I grew up in Hanoi, which is the capital of Vietnam. It's a large and busy city in the north of the country. Already, this answer is much better because it demonstrates longer and more complex sentence structures, such as a relative clause using which. Depending upon where you grew up, there may be slightly different vocabulary that you can use. I'm from England, which is divided into regions and counties. Some countries use words like province or zone, for example. It's a good idea to double-check the common terms used for your own answer, if you're not already sure which term is most suitable in English. To make your answer even more specific, you could say the name of the district, ward, or community that you grew up in within your town or city. Here's an example. I grew up in Beijing, which is the capital of China. My family lived in Dongjimen, which is in the Dongcheng district of the city. One aspect you might want to include is what type of area you grew up in case the person you're speaking to is not familiar with your town or city. Here are a few examples. It's close to the city centre. It's downtown. It's in the suburbs. It's a residential area. It's on the outskirts. If you're from the countryside, you can include information such as the name of your village and the area or region. You might also want to mention the largest town or city near your village. This is a common strategy that people from villages in my country use to help other people to understand where their village is located. Here's an example. I grew up in a village called Millbrook, which is in Cornwall, in the southwest region of England, and is close to Plymouth. At this point, I just want to clarify a couple of important pieces of vocabulary. Firstly, the phrasal verb grow up is active. It's about what we do ourselves. We grow. The past form is grew, hence we talk about where we grew up in the past. The present continuous form is growing up, so we can talk about how a young person is growing up quickly, for example. A common mistake I've heard occurs when parents talk about their own children. It is a mistake to say that you are growing up your child. Remember, grow up is active. Your child is growing up, but they are the one doing the growing, not you. As a parent, you are raising a child. To raise a child is the active form, so that is how we talk about what the parent is doing. For example, she is raising 3 children on her own. However, we can also use raise in the passive, which is to be raised. This is relevant to talking about our own childhood. we can talk about where we were raised. It gives us an alternative way to talk about growing up. Let's have a couple of examples. I grew up in Dhaka. I was raised in Dhaka. I grew up in Tashkent. I was raised in Tashkent. Because being raised is a passive structure, it can also include the by someone aspect. For example, I was raised in the countryside by my grandmother. Or I was raised in the city by my aunt and uncle. To confirm then, a child grows up, but a parent or caregiver raises a child. However, we can also talk about having been raised by someone. If you can use these verbs accurately in the test, it will really show off your English ability. So these verbs are definitely worth a review after the episode if you're still unclear. And if you've got any questions, please do let me know in the comments. I'm happy to help. Back to our answer then. If you lived in several places as a child, you can choose how to answer. If you only lived in 2 places, you might want to mention both of them in the test as a way of expanding your answer. For example, I was born in India and we lived there until I was 6. Then we moved to Canada and my family and I still live here now. However, if you're someone who moved around a lot as a child, you might choose to just mention the key places you lived so that you can control the length of your answer. You could say something like, well, my family moved around a lot when I was a child, but the place we stayed the longest was Dubai. And then you could go on to talk about growing up in Dubai. It can be quite common for families to move around due to the work of one or both parents. For example, a friend of mine lived in multiple countries as a child because his father was in the military. The father was posted in different countries over time and took his family along. Therefore, my friend's answer to this question would be much more complex than my own, as I lived in the same village for my whole childhood. How about you? Did you live in the same place for your whole childhood, or did your family move to one or more places? Another thing that might be relevant to talking about where you grew up is where you lived during different times of the year. I've spoken to quite a few people who went to live in a different place during their school summer vacation. This might be staying with different family members or going away to a summer camp, for example. So, if that's something that you did regularly, that might be something you choose to mention, to give you something interesting to talk about. You could mention where you went, for how long, and why. Here are a few examples. I mainly grew up in the city, but I used to go and live with my grandmother in the countryside every summer during the holidays to help her on the farm. Every summer, my parents sent me to a residential summer school, especially for students who wanted a career in science. It was a really great opportunity to learn. During term time, I lived in the city with my aunt, but in the summer holidays, I went home to the village where my parents live. These are just a few examples, so feel free to select the parts that suit your situation and build your own custom answer. The last thing I want to cover today is boarding school. A boarding school is a school where students live and study. In some places, it's quite common for young people to go to a boarding school, sometimes from quite a young age. If you're someone who lived at boarding school, you might want to include this in your answer. One way to do this is to say where your family lived, where the boarding school was, and approximately how much time you spent in the 2 different places. For example, when I was a child, my family lived in Yorkshire. When I was 8, I started going to boarding school in London, so during term time I lived in London at the school. To summarise then, to expand your answer you could include more specific details about the location of where you grew up, such as the region or what is nearby. If you lived in multiple places, you can choose which ones to mention. And if you spent parts of the year in different areas, you could also mention that. The next step is to take a few minutes to create your own example answer to the question, where did you grow up? Feel free to post your answer in the comments to get some extra practice. So go ahead, tell us about where you grew up in the comments section. According to the current poll on YouTube, the topic most popular in the votes is what games are popular in your country. So that's what we're looking at in the next episode. Thanks for joining me today, and don't forget, if you want a free copy of the podcast transcript, then head over to my IELTS blog and fill in the form. See you next episode for lots of useful phrases for talking about popular games in the IELTS speaking test. Thanks for listening and have a great day.